it's a wonderful group in the gallery and people still adding as we speak. We have here Hyrum Lewis and Verlan Lewis, who happen to be brothers and co-authors of a new January 2023 book, The Myth of Right, or rather Left and Right. Oxford University, Michelle in due course will be kind and put a link to the book in chat. It's timely, it's interesting, it's research oriented with tremendous public policy relevance. Hyrum and Verlan, welcome and congratulations on this new book. I'm not going to read their respective bios. You have them, you know them, and you can them very equally, but I'll tell you that they're both serious, interesting, and accomplished researchers and scholars, and obviously book authors. And I thought we'd talk to them a little bit in the first few minutes of how they came to write this book, the conceptual framework, and of course, what they're digging into and what they're after. But as soon as possible, open up to you for comments and questions, because you all represent a tremendous amount of knowledge and expertise on the line today. So with that, having said that, Hyrum and Verlan, again, welcome, again, congratulations. And I'm going to start by asking you that this is a book that does have a conceptual framework. It's about language and labels, and saying labels, it doesn't really quite do justice to the research you've undertaken, the book you produced. But could you tell us, in your words, kind of succinct and overview to start, what you're trying to capture? Because you've argued that the language of left and right does not, or no longer captures the reality inside today's, I would say, fragmented, if not polarized America. And we need a new way of thinking about it, or maybe a new way of describing it. Hyrum, could I call on you first?
Absolutely. So thanks for having us here at American Purpose. We're big fans of you guys' work. We feel like the struggle for, the work you're doing is the most important political work in the world. And we think our book has a great deal to say on that. Because you asked about the origins lie in the problems we saw with thinking in terms of a political spectrum. Paradigms have consequences, and bad paradigms lead to bad consequences. So in the 19th century, obviously, medicine was afflicted by a four humors theory, and doctors killed a lot of people because they had a bad framework. And we're arguing that the political spectrum is an inaccurate framework. It misleads, it misinforms, it causes hostility, does all kinds of terrible things to our country. And so the basic idea here is that there's obviously more than one issue in politics. And if there's more than one issue, then a political spectrum can't capture the complexity of politics. So we're stuck with this framework that simply doesn't work for the political landscape as it exists. Our map is not adequate to the landscape. So anyway, that's where I would start. I'm interested to hear what Verlan has to say.
Yeah, I'm happy to just chime in and reiterate a little bit what Hyrum was saying. Again, thanks so much for having us. We are big fans of American Purpose and what you're trying to do to preserve constitutional democracy in the world. And we're concerned that left-right thinking is undermining constitutional democracy, particularly here in the United States of America. And if we think about this false way of thinking about politics, if someone were to adopt this way of thinking, we can see why they might want to undermine traditional norms and restraints, things like the rule of law, like pluralism, like a respect for individual rights, for a respect for separation of powers and federalism, all these constitutional principles that we care a lot about. When people think about politics in terms of left and right, they're tempted to discard those traditional constraints on government power. And the reason is when they have that conceptual framework, they think all of their issue positions are emerging out of a coherent, transcendent philosophy, and all of their issue positions are correct. And the issue positions of the other political party are all mistaken and all wrong because they flow out of an enduring, coherent evil philosophy. And so it really does set up this false paradigm, this way of viewing politics that turns people who are in a different political party into these enemies that are not wrong just about a few things, but wrong about everything, about society, about religion, about economics, about the family. And so it sets up a real division in our society that we're seeing. Now, we don't use the term polarization, refer to this, because we think polarization implies something false. It implies the wrong idea that there are fixed poles of left and right. The reality is that the idea of polarization is creating a more and more affective polarization, more hostility, more anger, more tribalism in our society. So we're really concerned about that. We're fans of what American Purpose is doing, and we're hoping our book can help people see through some of the problems we're dealing with right now.
And Verlan, if I could just pick up from there, you say help people. Could you, and obviously Hyrum too, tell us a little bit about who the primary audience for this book is? Is it for educated Americans who are interested in politics and public policy? Is it directed more toward elites? Is it directed toward academics who study and sort things? Is it directed to the media class that so often fuel so much in our politics today? Who's the primary audience?
Yeah, great question. So one of the reasons that we wanted to publish this book with Oxford University Press is because we feel like they have a good niche in reaching both academics and general audiences. And that's something that we point out in the book is we're not here as political scientists saying, well, if ordinary people just understood what us social scientists understood, then the world would be all better off. Actually, just the opposite. A lot of ordinary Americans don't think about politics in terms of left and right. It's actually a certain segment of the population that does, and it's mostly college-educated people. Part of the reason being that this false paradigm is entirely prevalent and dominant within the political science discipline. This is what Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson have referred to as the master theory of the last half century of American politics. You cannot pick up a political science journal or a historical journal without finding the terms left and right somewhere in there. It's really dominant. And so this bad idea, this bad model is flowing out of the universities into the population writ large. And so we're trying to speak to other social scientists, to other educated general readers, and to your point, to also media figures. Now, the problem is media figures often have an incentive to talk about politics in terms of left and right, because that's what gets clicks and gets viewers. When you use left-right thinking, you can rely on passions like fear and anger. And, this election is the end of the world and that kind of stuff. Just look at who the most popular cable news hosts are on television. That's what gets ratings. So unfortunately, they have an economic incentive to promote this left-right thinking. The political parties also have an incentive to push the myth of left and right. But we're hopeful that an exhausted majority who's fed up with the constant anger and vitriol that we see in our public discourse today will be receptive to these ideas and force our news media outlets and our political parties to follow suit.
So let me ask you this, and I'll turn the microphone over to you, Hyrum. I don't recall whether I'm drawing from the book or from an op-ed you two co-authored in the Wall Street Journal, previewing some of the ideas or arguments in the book, where you say that left and right are a myth or an illusion, but tribal hostility is in fact what's driving so much in America. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so that's the basic framework of the book that we're using. Is essentially we compare and contrast two theories of ideology. Now, the dominant theory of left-right ideology is what we call the essentialist theory. And that theory is what pretty much every politician in the country believes, what every media figure, unfortunately, most of my colleagues in the history profession and most of Verlan's colleagues in political science. And the essentialist theory basically says this. It says a political spectrum is useful, even though there's many issues in politics, because all these many issues, abortion and taxes and affirmative action and drug control and gun control and aid to Ukraine, all these are just surface manifestations of one deep, big issue. So you say, why are we using a political spectrum if there's lots of issues? And they say, well, actually, there is just one. There's just one big one. And most of them would say it's change. If you're in favor of change, you're on the left. If you're against change, you're on the right. If you're really, really in favor of change, you're on the far left. If you're really, really against change, you're on the far right. That's the conceptual framework that the world is using right now. And that's prevalent. And we call that the essentialist theory. And the idea is that you start with a worldview or disposition. Maybe your worldview is progressivism. You like progress and change. And then once you have adopted that worldview, then you think yourself to all the many positions that are currently called progressive. Higher taxes on the rich, more government regulation of the economy, more restriction on environment, on matters to help stop climate change, legalization of drugs, more illegal immigration, these kinds of things. And so then once you have all those issue positions that grow out of your ism, then you join the tribe that agrees with you. That's what people think is happening. Our book is demonstrating that they have it exactly backwards, that in fact the essentialist theory is false, and there's simply no evidence that we're aware of that the essentialist theory is true. There's just none. So the reality is what we call the social theory of ideology is the one that appears to be correct. What the social theory says is that you start with the tribe. You anchor into a tribe because of family, because of peers. Maybe a psychological disposition leads you to one issue you feel very passionately about. Once you've anchored into the tribe, then you adopt the issues of that tribe as a matter of socialization, and then you cook up a story ex post to explain how all your positions are connected. So the ideology, progressivism, comes last. It's a story, not a philosophy. It's tacked on at the end. It's not the beginning. People don't start with progressivism and then adopt the policies. They start with the tribe, go to the policies, and then cook up the story afterwards. So the evidence for the social theory of ideology is really, really abundant. We cite tons of scholarship, the historical evidence, the lab evidence, the survey evidence. It sounds counterintuitive, but we're saying, and what we're saying is very radical. We're saying that there is no such thing as progressivism and conservatism. They're a myth. People think I'm a progressive because I adhere to progressivism. There is no ism behind the progressive. There's a progressive tribe, but there's no progressive-ism. What do abortion and tax cuts have to do with one another? The answer is nothing. So why is there a correlation among, the professors, the media figures, and the elites? Why is there a correlation that if you're against abortion, that you're also more likely to favor tax cuts? They would say it's because there's some underlying conservative philosophy connecting the two. We are saying that's not true. It's simply social. It's simply tribal conformity. If you feel strongly about abortion, you anchor into the right-wing tribe, and then through Sean Hannity and social media and all the rest, then you come to believe, oh, I have to believe in tax cuts too because that's what my side believes. And then you delude yourself that you're being principled, you're being conservative, you're following the conservative philosophy, you're in the tradition of Burke and all the rest. But so basically, the common sense is wrong, the conventional wisdom is wrong.
So thank you. That is helpful. To both of you, a question, and then we're going to open up to the gallery. What do you make of, and to what extent is this framework or handle, pardon me, compatible with your own research and findings? And that is, there's a journalist whom you know, not an academic, a journalist whom you know, in Britain, former editor of Prospect magazine named David Goodhart, who, in trying to understand back in the day the Trump and Bernie phenomenon, offered a handle that went roughly along these lines. It's not so much about left and right. It's about those who are struggling with social, economic, and technological change, those who are benefiting or better positioned to adapt, or as I say, benefit or profit from rapid social, economic, and technological change. And he gave us, as a good journalist, some language. He said, this is a divide between the somewheres and the anywheres. The somewheres are anchored in their communities by tradition and faith and values that they feel are challenged today. And the anywheres are those upwardly mobile, entrepreneurial, agile, adaptable class that know every frequent flyer language in the world, but they don't really understand where the Bernie and Trump voters are coming from. Sorry, that was a little bit long, but could you tell us what you make of that? And is any part of that standing the test of time? And is any part of that borne out by your research? Verlan, maybe you first.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think what that journalist is getting at, and it's something we want to make sure that we communicate, is there are very real differences and cleavages and groupings within our society. And these can run along a variety of different cleavages, right? So whether it's Aristotle's view that there's always going to be a divide between the few and the many, or if it's Madison's view that there's a constant divide between those who hold different forms of property, whether it's going to be divides over religion, whether it's urban, rural. We think that's a really important divide in American politics right now. Those are all really good, or I should say important and clear and obvious divides in our politics. What we're saying is there's no natural correlation between those variety of divides we see in society and left and right. And I think as you brought up Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, that's a good example of that, because the presidency of Donald Trump showed, right, a lot of evidence for our thesis that historically the very meanings of left and right are constantly changing. So left and right didn't exist in American politics for most of American history. No one ever talked about politics in terms of left and right until the 1920s, when progressive journalists and historians imported this framework in after reporting on the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. They thought this would be a useful framework for America. So it's been in America for 100 years, unfortunately, to our detriment. But the very meanings of what left and right have meant over the past century is constantly evolving, right? So there was once upon a time when people would say, well, the clear difference between left and right in America is the left is the philosophy in favor of the many, and conservatism, or the right, is the philosophy in favor of the few. Well, of course, the presidency of Donald Trump, I think, is a good repudiation or falsification of that hypothesis. Very much Trump's appeal within the Republican Party is appealing to, Americans who are struggling socially, economically. They feel looked down upon by elites on the coasts, and they wanted a class warrior to kind of go after those elites in American society. And increasingly, Team Blue has become the tribe for elites in society. So, and the issue positions change. Republicans once upon a time talked about reforming entitlements. Donald Trump wants nothing to do with that, wants to increase government spending, and did drastically increase government spending and deficits during his presidency. Republicans once upon a time said that character mattered. That was a real big issue for those who called themselves conservatives in the 1990s. The survey data shows that the two tribes have completely switched on that survey question about how important is character in elected officials. Once upon a time, conservatives were more hawkish on foreign policy. Now they've become less hawkish, and it's those who call themselves liberals who have become more hawkish. You look at issue after issue, trade, whatever it is, the positions of the two parties are constantly changing, and the positions of conservatism and progressivism are constantly changing, which is more evidence that these are social constructs.
Verlan, thank you. Hyrum, let's give the microphone to you and then we'll open it up. But please, you have the floor.
Yeah, sure. So I would say, I appreciate Goodhart's rethinking our categories, but we see this a lot where people try to overthrow the left-right spectrum, but lapse into just another binary. And unfortunately, politics is not binary. There's so many issues in politics. So we used to, some people want to reduce it to left and right, change versus preservation. He says, no, it's about technologically savvy versus left behind. He's still stuck in a binary. So maybe think of it this way. Look, if I went to the grocery store and they were out front waiting for me with just 2 baskets of groceries, that would be unfortunate. I wish I could go inside and pick all my groceries on my own. But let's say there was just 2 baskets out there. Well, that's basically how it is when you and I go in the voting booth. We're stuck saying either Republican or Democrat. Now, that's fine. We're not against the two-party system. Some people think we are. Some people think we're saying, we should have more than just 2 choices when we vote. That's not at all what we're saying. 2 choices when we vote may be the best way to organize elections. I happen to think it is. But what you wouldn't want to do is you wouldn't want to look at those baskets, and say, okay, I chose basket A because I like more of its products. And instead of saying, well, it's a whole random basket of products and I slightly like this one better than the other basket, you'd say, no, everything in basket A is better than everything in basket B because they're all philosophically connected. That's what the left-right spectrum does. It's a tool of delusion. Instead of accepting the basket nature of politics, you might say, well, yeah, I'm in favor of tax cuts, but I also believe in abortion rights and helping the environment, but I'm also against this critical race theory stuff, so I vote Republican. Yeah, it's a basket. It's mixed. That's where most people are. They're not uniform. But elites and political scientists try to tell us, no, 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 everything in that basket goes together because it all grows out of conservatism. And everything in that basket goes together because it all grows out of progressivism. So if we think in terms of these baskets, there's many, many different things. And yes, we have to vote for one basket or the other. But what we're asking for is to stop the delusion that there's some kind of philosophical coherence behind the things in that basket, because there's clearly not. And when it comes to politics, there's no philosophical coherence between affirmative action policy, abortion policy, drug policy, tax policy, invading Iraq. I mean, what does invading Iraq have to do with tax cuts? Nothing. But why did Republicans overwhelmingly support both Bush's tax cuts and the invasion of Iraq? Because they were under the delusion that those two were philosophically consistent, and they had to support both or be a traitor to the true principles of conservatism. That's the myth of left and right. That's what our society has to get away from, because if we don't, we are stuck believing in one side all good, one side all bad, and that makes compromise impossible. It makes even dialogue impossible. No wonder people are shouting down on college campuses, because in their view, once you've adopted the right side, the correct side of the political spectrum, if you're on the left and everything on the left is in favor of social justice, well, then I already have all the answers. I'm omniscient. I know exactly what's right simply by virtue of the fact that it's considered left wing. Therefore, why would I even let somebody with an alternative view speak? I know they're wrong a priori, and we will be contaminating the world. We will be polluting the world by associating with something that I know is intrinsically evil, because it grows out of an evil right-wing philosophy. So the whole concept of left and right is a major tool of destruction, misinformation, and we are rather silly as Americans for continuing to deploy it to speak about politics.
So Hyrum, thank you, and Verlan, thank you very much. I think this point that you raised, Hyrum, about binary is pardon me, maybe a deep rather cultural and structural issue we face in this country. You know, in many of our conversations, we do, and one feels forced to inhabit these little cubby holes. You're either an isolationist or you're a mad global international interventionist. And by the way, I just say as a footnote before I open it up, as many on this call know, because for talk shows pre-screen you as a guest, and they won't fit into a certain mold for a certain kind of debate. And if the debate is about, pick a subject, Iran, Ukraine, China, I'm talking about foreign affairs right now, and you say, yes, I believe in this, and yes, I believe in this. However, I'm undecided, or no, I don't advocate that position, bookers often throw you out because they're trying to get A versus B and 3 points on each side. That's good television, not someone who says, well, now I have to agree with my opponent. That's where I part with the such and such party. I'll let that stand. You two have been terrific, very clear, very incisive, very succinct. The floor is now open with 30 minutes left. Press the raised hand function, and I'll call on you when I don't see you. Michelle will tell me. And Michelle, you have someone already?
Len Breslow and then Pedro Fonseca.
And there we are. And Len, you have the floor. And in each case, would you all tell us who you are? Some know, some don't.
I'm Len Breslow. Anything else? I have to say, I loved your book. I read it, and I feel like I've been waiting for this book for years. And you can see, maybe you can't see how old I am, so that's quite a while. So in reading it, one question not entirely answered for me is how people change tribes. What makes people change tribes? Maybe that's not the main question on most people's mind here today, but you talk mostly of intellectuals who are highly involved in issues, and they tend to be the ones who think in terms of left and right. And there's some issue that's too important to them, so when the tribe changes on that issue, they change. but you have the mass of people too, this huge change. I mean, I'm just as an example, a recent example, the working class has been moving from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. There have been many changes over the years. And so I wonder if you have some insight into how that comes about.
Verlan, go for it.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the example you give is a really interesting one. In fact, I have a friend, John Shields at Claremont McKenna College, that just wrote a book called Trump's Democrats, which talks about people who identified as Democrats but moved over to vote for Trump and began identifying as Republicans. So I think there's two ways that people will switch tribes. One way is that they are not strongly tethered to an ideology. They do not consider themselves liberal or conservative. So I think a lot of the white working class that you talk about that moved from Democrat to Republican during the Trump era were those kinds of people. They didn't really think of themselves as liberal, but maybe they, belonged to a labor union and they were against free trade. That was an issue they cared about, or they relied on entitlement spending, and so they wanted to make sure that there was spending on Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. There was a few issues that they cared about, and that led them to choose the Democratic basket for a lot of years. And then along comes someone like Donald Trump, and all of a sudden those groceries have been put in the other basket, and they start, oh, I like that, and so they switch parties, right? So I think that's one version of this. The other group, occasionally you will find people who strongly identify with an ideological tribe, and they will occasionally switch tribes, but that's very rare. And these are people that I'm thinking of, like in the 1930s, people who formed the American Liberty League, right? They considered themselves liberals, and to them, liberal meant limited government, free markets, free trade, and that's what Franklin Roosevelt campaigned on in 1932. And then he went against all of that when he became president during the New Deal. And people like Al Smith and John Jacob Rascov and people who had been leaders in the Democratic Party said, well, this is a betrayal of our principles. We're leaving the party and we're going to form this American Liberty League and vote for Republicans. Now, that's rare. Most Democrats, most people who call themselves liberals in the 1930s just went along with FDR, and they said, FDR is doing the opposite of what we used to believe. Oh, that's fine. It's all liberalism. We're still being philosophers. We're principled philosophers, and the New Deal is actually liberal. What you don't really understand is that old stuff about free markets and free trade, that wasn't really liberal. This new stuff is what's really liberal. In the 1960s, something similar happened with people who cared a lot about foreign policy. They had been Democrats. They considered themselves Cold War liberals. They were concerned about what the Democratic Party was doing in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Going soft on communism and being more pacifist or dovish on foreign policy. That issue really mattered to them, so they called themselves neoconservatives and started voting for Republicans, and they moved. But again, that's very rare. We see it again happening with some people who call themselves never Trump conservatives more recently. There's certain issues they really care about. But that's the minority. Most people simply go along with the changes in the tribe's issue positions, and then they justify those changes by saying, well, it all flows out of conservatism or liberalism.
Yeah, and thank you for your kind words. You said this is the book you were waiting for. Makes three of us, right? I mean, that's why we wrote it. We were waiting for somebody to say the emperor has no clothes, and nobody did. So we said, that's the origin of this book. We've got to write it because nobody else will, because it really is kind of an emperor has no clothes situation here, and we just had to kind of say the obvious. So that's what we're trying to do here. So we appreciate that. But I would say, so like Verlan says, the masses, they don't think ideologically. They're much more granular in their approach. They do consider the parties as baskets. And so they see the basket, the content of the baskets changing, and they gravitate. Intellectuals, on the other hand, they're much better at self-delusion. That's why intellectuals are ideologically consistent. Who's the guy who writes for the Washington Post who's now, says he's a true conservative but agrees with everything the Democrats do? So they think in terms of ideological consistency. And so when they anchor into a different tribe, like so they say, Donald Trump, he's terrible, he's a deal breaker. Then they went and ran to the Democratic Party and to that tribe. And now you find them justifying everything the Democratic Party does. So it's like astrology. If I went into an astrologer's office and I told them what month I was born in, they could concoct a story to say how everything I do fits my astrological sign, because they're smart. That's why people believe astrologers. So what the intellectuals are doing is nothing less than astrology. And left-right ideology and the myth of left and right is as intellectually flimsy as astrology. We don't believe in astrology. Academics don't. And yet here we are believing in something that has the same amount of intellectual evidence as does astrology. And the only quote evidence for it is storytelling to try to bind all these things together. But intellectuals are very good at it. And that's why intellectuals are suckers for the myth of left and right.
So Len, thanks for getting us started. And thank you, Hyrum and Verlan. Michelle, I don't see always on my iPad the people on the top row.
Pedro Fonseca.
Sorry?
Pedro Fonseca is next.
So Pedro and then Patrick. Okay.
Okay, I'm very sorry for my name. I'd like to start there. I'm speaking from Portugal, and it's a tremendous honor to be here with you. I've been following the American Purpose for quite some time now, and I did so because I'm a history student and PhD, and being so, I follow Francis Fukuyama very closely, and all the books and works that he publishes. So that put me into contact with American Purpose some time ago, and I've been following you ever since. And I'd like to thank you because you've been sharing extremely important articles and events such as these. And speaking of Francis Fukuyama, I believe that this book, I haven't read it yet, and I hope that it does reach, it has reached Europe, and that there can be some translations into Portuguese and Spanish and other languages, because I believe it is all the more necessary. And it is a kind of a follow-up, I believe, to Francis Fukuyama's politics of identity. Now, what I found curious is, for us here in Europe, the way we look at you, like at the States, is you don't have a left. You have a split right. That's how we look at you. We look at you. Bernie Sanders was quite, on top of the line near the left, but he didn't make it. So how we look at America, and we've looked since we have contemporary memory, is that you have a conservative with a very limited state welfare policy, and that tends to favor big corporations with the Republican Party. And then you have the Democrats that are somewhat more progressive in some causes like abortion, for example, drug control, and have more consistent policies regarding state welfare, and economically speaking, have a more widespread agenda. But we don't see you having a left. Then I'd like to ask you a question, and it's the following. I was tied to an animal rights movement, and we got together as a tribe because some were more to the right, some were more to the left, some didn't care whatsoever about economics or culture or healthcare, but we all cared about animals, abandoned animals in shelters. We all cared about bullfighting. We all cared about vegetarian food. The problem is that tribe, as soon as we formed the party, the tribe started to fall apart because we had to answer other questions. You can't be a political party and people get near you and say, okay, so what's your stance on foreign affairs? Or what's your stance on public education? Or what's your stance on healthcare? And or what's your stance? I can remember this. 2 people left because they were homophobic and they couldn't tolerate being in a party that was going to be progressive on that issue. So they just left. They said, no, I can't stand this. I won't be here. I'm just looking at the point from how it's not how you get into the tribe, it's how you leave it. What makes you leave the tribe? Because there's going to be something that pulls you in, and then there's going to be one or more points that are going to throw you out. And as Jeffrey was saying, I can remember some years back, Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, was on Sean Hannity. And to Sean Hannity, probably to his surprise, he was expecting someone from, he was a Bush supporter at the time, Christopher Hitchens, and he supported the war on Iraq. What Sean Hannity wasn't expecting was that Christopher Hitchens would be so aggressive towards religion. And he even said, I've had enough of you today. because he wasn't expecting that. You know, he wasn't supposed to say that. He was supposed to be a typical Republican, so he should be, it should have a mild or favorable position to religions from a Christian branch, and he wasn't doing so. So he said, "I've had enough of you today," and he just cut him off like that. Congratulations on the book to both the authors, and many congratulations to American Purpose. We follow you quite closely here in Portugal.
Lovely. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, who would like to go first?
I can jump in since Verlan had to last time. As far as Frank Fukuyama goes, thank you for the kind words. We are big Fukuyama fans. We think he's correct. He's lately come around to where we are. It seems like saying, the political spectrum, no longer measures class here in the 21st century. He's correct on the nature of the change. He's incorrect on the timing. He thinks it's recent. He forgets that the Bush years happened. And Bush was the biggest spending president in American history. So this idea that Republicans were always the party of small government and conservative and right wing meant small government until Donald Trump simply isn't true. I mean, look, in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler was a socialist and considered extreme right wing. So the idea that the right is associated with small government, limited government, free markets, that's simply ahistorical, not true, but we're glad to see Fukuyama coming around to what we think is the correct view here. The second thing I would say is, how do people leave parties or tribes? It's because they're thinking about it wrong. Left and right is a totalizing way of looking at things. It says that everything in these, you have a basket and it's all good, a basket that's all bad. And so if somebody doesn't agree with me in even one thing, well, then clearly they're apostate, not a true progressive, not a true conservative, and therefore I can't associate with them. As soon as we get away from left-right thinking, that problem disappears. It disappears. You say, look, it's two grocery baskets. And yes, I don't like this in the grocery basket. Fine. So what? This grocery basket is still better than the other one. So once we think in terms of grocery baskets rather than totalizing ideologies, once we see politics in granular terms and see each tribe as containing many things, and there is no such thing as purity, there is no such thing as a progressive-ism, there's just a whole bunch of stuff, some that I'll agree with and I won't agree with, then it lowers the temperature. And we say, of course, I'm not going to agree with anyone about everything, because there is no one overarching philosophy that binds all the good guys and one overarching philosophy that binds all the bad guys. It makes you much more likely to compromise. It makes you much more likely to be charitable and to listen and to be open-minded, much less likely to kick people out or the way that we are now, and the excommunications that go on. Once you see politics as what it is granular, a whole bunch of issues with no relationship with one another, then we say, well, obviously I'm not going to agree with everyone on everything because there's no underlying philosophy tying everything together, and therefore I need to be more charitable and understanding because nobody's going to agree with me on everything. So the leaving the tribe, I would say, is a function of the totalizing perspective that the myth of left and right creates.
Verlan, do you want to add on this before we go to Patrick and Barbara?
Sure, I can just say a couple things. Yeah, so thanks again, Pedro, for your question. And to follow up on Hyrum's analogy about the two grocery baskets, I think in your particular question about, if a person really cares about a particular issue, so in your case, animal rights, maybe that's like going to the grocery store and saying, there's one issue I really care about, whichever basket has that item in it, I'm going to get that basket because that just matters more than anything else, regardless of what else is in the basket. And that's fine. That can be, an issue that you really care about. It's something that's really important to you. We think that can be a rational way to approach politics. But again, what you wouldn't want to do is say, therefore, everything else in this basket, I prefer over everything else in that basket. We need to keep these political parties at an arm's length. Yes, they can be useful for us. They can be vehicles for policies that we care about, but don't pretend that there's philosophies that are binding together all of these issue positions, and therefore everything in this one is right and everything in that other one is wrong. And I'll just mention a couple examples that you gave that can maybe clarify this a little bit. So for example, you talked about, what progressivism is and how certain parties are more progressive on abortion policy or same-sex marriage. But again, that's completely historically constructed and subject to historical evolution. For most of the 20th century, the progressive tribe tended to be more pro-life than the conservative tribe, right? It wasn't until the late 70s, really until the 1980 presidential election, where the two parties switched on this issue of abortion. Same thing with gay rights. People forget this, but Franklin Roosevelt campaigned as a progressive, but he made a name for himself by prosecuting homosexuality in the Navy when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the Wilson administration. That wasn't a progressive conservative thing. There's nothing inherently in progressivism or in conservatism that forces people to have particular issues on abortion, on gay marriage, on religion, or anything else. It's just a matter of historical contingency why the parties take the issue position they do. They were different 20 years ago. They'll be different next year. They'll be different 20 years from now.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks, Pedro. We're going to go to Patrick and Barbara. We've got 14 minutes left. We'll see where we are after this next round. Patrick.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, 40 minutes is plenty enough for myself. No, sorry. So thank you for writing the book. I look forward to reading it, of course. I think you are absolutely right that there are no essentialist, two camps, that can be defined philosophically. It's been tried, and I don't think that anybody agrees on what it could be if it has to be. Second, that the issues change all the time between right and left, and people, of course, change their camps. Yet, I wonder. It's obviously a book about American politics. As my accent betrays, I'm European, and actually I'm from the country where those notions of right and left were invented at the French Revolution. And so I was wondering if you have given some thoughts about the relevance of your thesis in Europe, or if it's just for the United States. My sense is that these two camps or philosophies, which again are very difficult, and maybe it's completely useless to even try to define them, but they still, in Europe at least, and define two different kind of sensitivities in people, your two inclinations, two proclivities, and that at the institutional level, party level, also, there are parties of the right, parties of the left. And actually, I would say the right and left dichotomy is maybe more useful because they are multi-parties. Because in the US, you don't need to right and left, because you have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and they fill up the whole spectrum. So anyway, I wanted to know how far do you think your thesis goes, and whether it's applied to Europe as well, where I think that most parties, with exceptions, of course, still fit into the right-left dichotomy. Thank you.
Well, I would say, doing international analysis proves the point. So you're right, we didn't do a lot of international analysis just because it's not where our expertise is. But if you look, for instance, at China, so we consider China, it's a Communist Party state, far left, right? Communism, if that's not far left, what is? And yet, if you look at the Communist Party's policies, they are anti-abortion. You can get thrown in jail, or not anti-abortion, anti-pornography. You can get thrown in jail for this spiritual corruption, as they call it. They're very much anti-drug. You go to life sentence for a drug infraction, right? I mean, so these are things that are considered right-wing in America. So the fact that it's not just you can look through time and see the meaning of right and left constantly changing, but you can look through space and see the meaning of right, left changing. That underscores the point. So the mythology that, yes, there's a spectrum because there's two inclinations and two personality types, and you're somewhere in a spectrum between these two personality types, that is disproven in so many ways, and the international experience is just one of those ways that it's disproven, because the basket of issues is different where you look. I mean, in Tito's Yugoslavia, it was rabidly anti-abortion. Wait, he was radical left-wing. What? That's right. Because those terms don't work. There's two different issues. There's one called capitalism versus communism, more versus less government control in the economy. That's one issue. And then there's abortion. That's a totally different issue. There's nothing inconsistent about that. And people who say otherwise are falling prey to the essentialist fallacy that somehow there's a philosophy of progressivism that demands that you believe in more government intervention in the economy and less government intervention on a woman's body. There's no relationship between those two things. But I really am interested in what Verlan has to say, because he did his graduate study at Cambridge. He's lived in Europe and knows it well, whereas I've never been. So I'm speaking from ignorance here. Verlan, why don't you give us your thoughts there?
Well, no, thank you for your question, Patrick. And yeah, we actually talk about the origins of the left-right spectrum in the French Revolution that you referred to. And I think it's plausible that, right, there could be different personality types, someone being more in favor of change or someone being more in favor of, cautious and not wanting too much change. But that has nothing to do with left and right. And I think that's clear in our politics. Both parties want some things changed and they want some things preserved, and it just depends on the issue, and it depends on the timing of that issue. So yes, this spectrum emerges at the time of the French Revolution. Those on the right were more opposed to the French Revolution. Those on the left-hand side of the speaker at the French Assembly were more in favor of the revolution. But that was one issue. And as soon as you add more and more issues to it, we're not talking about the French Revolution anymore. We're talking about hundreds of other issues. A unidimensional spectrum can no longer model more than one issue.
So thank you, Patrick. Here's what I'd like to do. We have 9 minutes left and 3 people I'm very eager to bring into the conversation. So not quite fair or elegant, but there we are. I'm going to take Barbara and Fritz and Mike Gendra together, and then we will give you, Hyrum and Verlan, a final chance to pick and choose and reply. We're going to wrap in 8 minutes. So, Barbara, you have the floor.
This is a quick question. I recently became involved with an organization called Braver Angels, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but I read this book. It was wonderful. I made so many notes in it. I might have the answer to this somewhere in those notes. The one thing that I'm going to just ask specifically, though, the last chapter, the 4 things that you put in there as ways that we can overcome this are what in Braver Angels, they match this thing we call the Braver Angels way, really. They're so right on. But the thing you said at the beginning, one of you two said at the beginning, and I didn't get it all down, you don't like to use the term polarization. And Braver Angels, that's kind of what drew me in. I said, we're trying to defeat this polarization. And I always tell people we're about defeating polarization. So we use the term a lot, but you said there was a negative thing why you don't use the term polarization. Can you repeat that?
So that's, before they repeat that, that's a great question. Hold that thought, and we love Braver Angels.
Good.
So hold that thought. Let's go to you, Fritz.
All right. Well, along those lines, this is perfect. I'm glad you mentioned polarization, because I'd be curious as to how you look at social media. Social media, we can all agree, I think polarizes, tends to push people out to extremes. And yet, on the other hand, polarization also fragments. It causes, you could create 100 parties with polarization. So is it the party structure in the US or the approach we use versus parliamentary systems? So there we go. It's way too broad a question. So focus, please, on whatever aspect of polarization versus fragmentation.
Well, that's a fantastic question. At the moment of the final demise, well, Fritz would know this more than anybody else, the Weimar Republic was so well represented. They had 44 parties in parliament. Isn't that democratic? Mike Gendra.
Yes. So I had a Braver Angels question also. Thank you, Barbara. Just to add, I think Braver Angels agrees with the tribalist kind of analysis of what's happened in politics, but they're stuck using these red-blue categories. So they're stuck using a polarization model. I think sociologically there is some polarization. So they have to use these red-blue models. What do you think about that? Should they continue to use that or not?
Lovely. Let's, if I may suggest, reverse the order. We'll take Verlan first, and Hyrum will wrap it up. Verlan.
Great. Thank you for all your questions. And thanks again, everyone, for your time and your interest. We're so flattered that you'd be interested in these ideas. So yeah, I actually have a colleague here at the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University who is heavily involved with Braver Angels, and I'm a fan of what she's doing here. And in talking with her and learning more about the organization, I actually like that they use the language of reds and blues. And here's why. In the book, we talk about how we want to change our language to be more accurate and use language that implies truth rather than false things. So let me connect that to why I don't like polarization. The political science literature talks about polarization in two different ways. One way is ideological polarization, where they assume that there's just one issue in politics, there's a unidimensional spectrum running left to right, and you're either an extreme ideologue going to the left and to the right, and that means polarization. We've talked about why we think that's a false way of thinking about politics. The second way that it's used in political science is affective polarization, which just means how much anger or hostility you have towards another group. Now, we actually think that's something that's real, that's happening in our politics. The myth of ideological polarization is driving a reality of affective polarization. There is increasing hostility, anger, and divisiveness in our society. However, the reason I think we should, even though that is a true phenomenon, I would ask people not to say affective polarization, is because polarization implies that there are poles toward which people move, and that brings in the baggage of a unidimensional spectrum and the baggage of left and right. So that's why we just say, talk about increased hostility, increased divisiveness, anger, but polarization, again, brings in that baggage of left and right, which we don't think is a good way to think about politics. I actually like the reds and blues because that implies something true, which is that these are social groups. They're not coherent philosophical belief systems. They're social groups that are constantly subject to change, and colors imply that truth, just like colors on a team's uniforms can imply that, right? The players can come and go, but the colors of the jersey remain the same. And I might root for the Dodgers, right? I was watching the Dodgers yesterday, love them, they're playing the Cubs. And Cody Bellinger is out there in a Cubs uniform, and all the Dodgers fans are booing him. Did anything change about Cody Bellinger? No, he's the same guy, but he just has on a different jersey. And that's the way our politics happens to operate right now. The issue positions of the two tribes are always changing, but people will change their positions on the issues to remain part of their tribe. Is that useful?
Yeah.
Useful indeed. Verlan, thank you. Hyrum, final remarks.
Yeah, so I would say, we're talking about polarization versus fragmentation. I say something really controversial here. I am not against fragmentation. You hear constant, this is a constant refrain in our media. People, can't we all just get along? We're too divided as a country. I couldn't disagree with more. I'm glad we're divided. That's good that we're divided. That's human nature. Our founding fathers wanted division. That's what preserves liberal democracy. The secret to freedom is the division of power. If everybody's united, well, welcome to Hitler's Germany. Welcome to North Korea. They're united there. They all agree. They're forced to agree. So the idea that we're fragmented is, it's not a bad thing. The problem is we're fragmented in the wrong way. So there's constructive fragmentation. And if we dialogue between disagreement in a humble way of finding out what other people think, considering evidence, openness to changing our mind, that's terrific. That's the scientific method. The scientific method is systematic disagreement, right? Falsification of hypotheses. Systematic disagreement. We want that in our politics. So we do like, at least I like fragmentation. I want to see more of it. But the problem is when you have the myth of left and right, it kills that humility. It kills that ability to listen to other people because you're coming from a mental space that tells you that not just this person disagrees with me on an issue, but they hold an evil worldview. And the same way I wouldn't talk and dialogue with Adolf Hitler, I'm not going to talk and dialogue with somebody who believes in tax cuts or somebody who believes there should be any abortion restrictions because they obviously are on the same side as Adolf Hitler and just as evil. I'm not going to listen to them. I'm not going to open my mind to them. I'm basically going to shut down my rational faculties. And the neuroscience even shows this. I mean, Philip Tetlock has done great work showing how thinking in terms of left and right kills your ability to think accurately and to forecast things. But you can do brain imaging studies too that show when people are thinking tribally, when they're thinking left and right, the lizard brain lights up, the frontal cortex shuts down. Turn on that frontal cortex. Disagree. It's good to be fragmented, but do it constructively, open-mindedly, and rationally. And once we get rid of the myth and left and right, that will be much enhanced.
So Hyrum, I can't resist from your comments at the end. It also strikes me that we are exhausting and hollowing out language, because if I say you and I disagree on healthcare reform and that makes you evil, what language do I have left to describe the regime of North Korea that starves its people to death? Let me say the following. If you can turn your camera on, if your camera's off and you're in position to turn it on, to in this way thank our guests of honor and greet everybody. We have people from Sweden today and people from Portugal today, different parts of the United States. Please do that just to say hi and bye. And Hyrum and Verlan, what a constructive, rich, stimulating hour. We're grateful. The Myth of Left and Right, 2023, Oxford University Press. You've gifted us a wonderful hour. Gentlemen, thank you. And everybody, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. It's our pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all.